This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., Jan H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, and Ali. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and those of you who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and to continue our series here on the Christian mystics, female Christian mystics in particular, this particular episode is going to be about St. Catherine of Siena. Now, the last episode we talked about St. Teresa of Avila and went into a bit about her divine ecstasy, in the way in which her relationship with the divine was couched in these very almost amorous kind of terms. You have that statue of her, the ecstasy of St. Teresa, where the angel is, literally plunging the arrow into her heart. And of course, there's almost something very sexual and sexualized about it. And we have some other interesting imagery of that type when we talk about St. Catherine of Siena. Now, what I want to do in this particular episode is I'm going to start by talking about her biography. We're going to get to all the factual stuff about her, when she lived, and everything about not only her life, but also about her canonization and sort of things that happened after that. And so we're going to get into the basic facts, which I'm actually going to take from the Catholic Encyclopedia, which is called the New Advent Encyclopedia. Some of it, I've looked at Wikipedia, but it certainly, because she is a Catholic saint, the Catholic site's going to be a bit more accurate, I think, on the details of her life. So we'll talk about that first, and then we're going to get into some specifics in terms of the imagery, in terms of the main features about her. And we'll also take a look at a couple other Catholic perspectives on her as well. Now, St. Catherine of Siena, I have read some of her stuff. I'm not as versed in her as I was in the Teresa of Avila material. And I think from what I have actually read in preparation from this podcast, we're seeing a similar kind of formula and style as we did in the writings of Teresa, but we will get to that. And obviously, as a podcast on the dark feminine, the focus that I'm going to be having here is the ways in which Catherine of Siena dealt with the archetype of the feminine, how she embodied that archetype, and how she may have either deviated from that archetype or the way or the effect of fully embodying that archetype and of femininity, at least within the Christian view of femininity or view of ideal femininity. What that ended up looking like, what this meant for her in her life, what kind of power she had, and ways in which Catherine of Siena took power for herself. And I don't mean that in in one of those grabbing, villainous kind of ways, but the way in which mystical life, this renunciate life, the way in which it becomes a kind of rebellion or a way of gaining autonomy in a system where women don't have any autonomy. Okay, so let's start with her biography. Let's begin at the beginning here. So, St. Catherine of Siena was born at Siena, the 25th of March, 1347. She died in Rome on the 29th of April, 1380. And her feast day was considered to be April 29th and was later moved to April 30th. I'm just going to mention that because those of you who are interested in, in whatever sense, the old pagan calendars, We'll recognize the 30th of April as Walpurgisnight, as it's called, or Walpurgisnacht, which is called in Germany, but it's the day before, it's the eve of May Day, okay, just as Halloween or Samhain is the eve of 1st of November. It's like that day before. It's considered to be the official beginning of spring. And of course, May Day, we have these associations with fertility and life and summer and love. And we often see the eve before as being a kind of liminal space in which things open up, right? When the veil between the worlds becomes thin. So that immediately, even though the 29th is her original feast day, the fact that now there's discrepancy as to whether it's celebrated on the 29th or the 30th. But the fact that they would move her feast day to the 30th, I thought, and I guess every saint does have a feast day, but I find it rather interesting that this particular thinning of the veil day, which often was associated with witchcraft and things like that, it actually ends up being her feast day. Now, as a saint, I'm going to say this before I read this entry. She was the patron saint of philosophers, preachers, and students, particularly women in higher ed, and those who work with wheels or mills, okay? Which I thought was interesting, possibly because, well, I don't know. I don't want to say that. Her father was apparently a dyer, like dyed cloth and things like that by trade, and her father was Giacomo di Benincasa. He was a dyer. Her mother, Lapa, was the daughter of a local poet. I think Wikipedia has it backward and says she's the daughter of a poet, but no, she's actually the daughter of a dyer. And she's the youngest of a large family. Yes, I believe she was child number 23. All I can say is I feel really sorry for Lapa having that many children. I mean, oh my, yeah. I mean, you hear about these families where people have like 10, 12, 13, 14, the old Duggars thing, and, where they were having close to 20 children. I mean, it's just crazy. I don't understand. I kind of feel like it's like, okay, it's not only do I not understand how you can produce that many children, but where you would actually find time to conceive them. But in any case, she did, and there were children born after her. I think Lapa had up to 25 children before she, I don't remember when she passed away exactly, but yeah, it said, so it says she's the youngest but one. Yes, that's right. So she's like number 24, and like there was another child, 25. Okay, it says they belong to the lower middle class faction of tradesmen and petty notaries known as the Party of the 12, which between one revolution and another ruled the Republic of Siena from 1355 to 1368. From her earliest childhood, Catherine began to see visions and practice extreme austerities. Okay. At the age of 7, she consecrated her virginity to Christ. In her 16th year, she took the habit of the Dominican tertiaries. Now, a tertiary is somebody who they don't necessarily live in a convent. It's more like they're living in a secular life, but they follow certain vows of obedience to that particular order, and renewed the life of the anchorites of the desert in a little room in her father's house. After 3 years of celestial visitations and familiar conversation with Christ, she underwent the mystical experience known as the spiritual espousals, which is basically like a mystical marriage. And we'll talk about that, probably during the carnival of 1366. She now rejoined her family, began to tend to the sick, especially those afflicted with the most repulsive diseases, to serve the poor, and to labor for the conversion of sinners. Though always suffering terrible physical pain, living for intervals on practically no food save the Blessed Sacrament, she was ever radiantly happy and full of practical wisdom, no less than the highest spiritual insight. All her contemporaries bear witness to her extraordinary personal charm, which prevailed over the continual persecution to which she was subjected, even by the friars of her own order and by her sisters in religion. She began to gather disciples round her, both men and women, who formed a wonderful spiritual fellowship, united to her by the bonds of mystical love. During the summer of 1370, she received a series of special manifestations of divine mysteries, which culminated in a prolonged trance, a kind of mystical death in which she had a vision of hell, purgatory, and heaven, and heard a divine command to leave her cell and enter the public life of the world. She began to dispatch letters to men and women in every condition of life, entered into correspondence with the princes and republics of Italy, was consulted by the papal legates about affairs of the church, and set herself to heal the wounds of her native land by staying the fury of civil war and the ravages of faction. She implored the Pope, Gregory XI, to leave Avignon, which is when they had This was the whole period of the popes and the anti-popes and making France the capital of the church instead of Rome and Italy, to reform the clergy and the administration of the papal states, and ardently threw herself into his design for a crusade in the hopes of uniting the powers of Christendom against the infidels, and restoring peace to Italy by delivering her from the wandering companies of mercenary soldiers. While at Pisa on the fourth Sunday of Lent, she received the stigmata, although at her special prayer, the marks did not appear outwardly in her body while she lived. Stigmata being, by the way, if you're not sure what that is, that has to do with the wounds of Christ, so the bloody wounds from the crucifixion, including the lance in the side and the nails through the hands and the feet. So supposedly people with stigmata, their palms will spontaneously bleed or something like that. It says, mainly through misgovernment of the papal officials, war broke out between Florence and the Holy See, and almost the whole of the papal states rose in insurrection. Catherine had already been sent on a mission from the Pope to secure the neutrality of Pisa and Lucca. In June 1376, she went to Avignon as an ambassador of the Florentines to make their peace, but either through the bad faith of the Republic or through a misunderstanding caused by the frequent changes in government, she was unsuccessful. Nevertheless, she made such a profound impression on the mind of the Pope that in spite of the opposition of the French king and almost the whole of the Sacred College, he returned to Rome in 17 January, which weirdly, that's today, 1377. Catherine spent the greater part of 1377 in effecting a wonderful spiritual revival in the country districts subject to the Republic of Siena, and it was at this time she miraculously learned to write, though she still seems to have chiefly relied upon her secretaries for her correspondence. Early in 1378, she was sent by Pope Gregory to Florence to make a fresh effort for peace. Unfortunately, through the factious conduct of her Florentine associates, she became involved in the internal politics of that city, and during a popular tumult on the 22nd of June, an attempt was made upon her life. She was bitterly disappointed at her escape, declaring that her sins deprived her of the red rose of martyrdom. Nevertheless, during the disastrous revolution known as the Tumult of the Ciompi, she still remained at Florence or its territory until the beginning of August. News reached the city that peace had been signed between the Republic and the new Pope. Catherine then instantly returned to Siena, where she passed a few months of comparative quiet, dictating her dialogue, the book of her meditations and revelations. In the meantime, a great schism had broken out in the church. From the outset, Catherine enthusiastically adhered to Roman claimant Urban VI, who in November of 1378 summoned her to Rome. In the Eternal City, she spent what remained of her life working strenuously for the reformation of the Church, serving the destitute and afflicted, and dispatching eloquent letters on behalf of Urban to high and low in all directions. Her strength was rapidly becoming consumed. She besought her divine bridegroom to let her bear the punishment for all the sins of the world and to receive sacrifice of her body for the unity and renovation of the Church. At last it seemed to her that the bark of Peter was laid on her shoulders and that it was crushing her to death with its weight. After a prolonged and mysterious agony of 3 months, endured by her with supreme exultation and delight, Sexagesima Sunday until the Sunday before Ascension, she died. Her last political work, accomplished practically from her deathbed, was the reconciliation of Urban VI with the Roman Republic in 1380. Okay, so this is her brief biography. And we can see a number of interesting things here at the outset. First of all, this idea that she was really what was in essence an anchorite. And anchorites are women who... No, I shouldn't say women. It can be men or women who are anchorites. But they're those that withdraw for religious reasons from secular society, and they lead an intensely prayer-oriented, aesthetic, and Eucharist-focused life. They're a type of hermit in a way, but says they, unlike hermits, I'm just reading this from Wikipedia, they were required to take a vow of stability of place, opting for a permanent enclosure in cells, often attached to churches. Also, unlike hermits, anchorites were subject to a religious rite of consecration that closely resembled the funeral rite, following which they would be considered dead to the world and a type of living saint. Anchorites had a certain autonomy, as they did not answer to any ecclesiastical authority apart from bishops. Okay, so this is a type of monastic life, one that's frequently chosen by women, and I'm going to talk a bit more about anchorites and anchoritism, if that's a word, in the episode that I do on Julian of Norwich, because that I feel like she was more properly an anchorite. This was more of a case that she was living as this tertiary. She was living in this under these kinds of vows, but she was living within her family home, and she was kind of in her own room, as it were. She wasn't really sealed off, so to speak. But she basically practiced the ways of an anchorite and that kind of asceticism. And what I find very interesting about this is, and really that whole phenomenon in general, is the way in which, if you think about women and you think about the status of women, one of the things that was mentioned in the Wikipedia entry on Catherine of Siena that's not mentioned in the Catholic Encyclopedia. Let's see. I'm just going to read a little bit from this just to give you a flavor of where I'm going with this. It says, Lapa was 40 years old when she gave birth prematurely to her 23rd and 24th children, twin daughters named Catherine and Giovanna. After birth, Giovanna was handed over to a wet nurse and died soon after. Catherine was nursed by her mother and developed into a healthy child. She was 2 years old when Lapa had her 25th child, another daughter named Giovanna. As a child, Catherine was so merry, the family gave her the pet name of Euphrosyne. Euphrosyne. I'll say that correctly, which is Greek for joy. Yeah, I have to get that. There's some of these Greek words, like I can think of Memsine, that's another one that I think of that's connected with that, but Euphrosyne, I'd think about that for a minute. Okay. So it said that the reason that she decided from the time she was 6 or 7 to give her virginity to the church or to God, said she had her first vision of Christ when she was 5 or 6. She and a brother were on their way home visiting a married sister when she is said to have experienced a vision of Christ seated in glory with apostles Peter, Paul, and John. And so at age 7, she vowed to give her whole life to God. Okay, here it is. When Catherine was 16, her older sister Bonaventura died in childbirth. Already anguished at this, Catherine soon learned that her parents wanted her to marry Bonaventura's widower. She was absolutely opposed and started a strict fast. She had learned this from Bonaventura, whose husband had been far from considerate. But his wife had changed his attitude by refusing to eat until he showed better manners. Besides fasting, Catherine further disappointed her mother by cutting off her long hair in protest of being encouraged to improve her appearance to attract a husband. Okay, so this is where I want to start. Now, we look at the acts of a lot of these mystics, okay? Especially acts like this. And the one thing Catherine of Siena is really known for is something, there's actually a term for it. They call it anorexia mirabilis. And this is this idea of this miraculous lack of hunger that comes. In fact, the American Journal of Psychiatry says this about it. It says, holy anorexia means miraculous lack of appetite. It was popular among religious people in the Middle Ages. And they mention that Catherine of Siena is probably the most popular case. It says it reported at age 6, she saw Christ in pontifical vestments above her neighborhood Dominican church. 1 year later, she made a vow of perpetual virginity. She was familiar with the fasting behaviors of her sister, who would decrease her food intake to change her husband's bad attitude. Okay. After her sister died, Catherine responded with a massive fast to her parents' intention of arranging a marriage with her sister's widow. She joined the Dominican order after claiming a vision of Saint Dominic and declared Jesus came from heaven and gave her a ring as the wedding alliance. So we're going to talk about this ring too. Thus, she would be eternally married to Christ. Later in life, St. Catherine told her confessors that she could have conversations with Jesus. For almost all of her entire life, her diet consisted of water and vegetables, and by the age of 33, she had starved herself to death. So she died at age 33. She reported stomach pains that did not allow her to eat anything but the Holy Host. And they mention how self-starvation was common behavior among religious women in the Middle Ages, but usually not approved by religious authorities as a holy one. Suffering was considered a way to imitate Jesus in remembrance of Christ's torments during the Passion. Whereas holy men experienced suffering through physical punishment, women preferred this voluntary pain by fasting. In cases of extreme holiness, the follower of Christ would miraculously receive the stigmata as a reward for a devout and pious life. It says this was the case for St. Catherine. The experience of suffering through starvation turned her into a model of virtue to the extent that she received the wounds of Jesus during the Passion. And now what they're saying here is they're saying parallels between the medieval behavior and anorexia nervosa are now apparent. In both, a person fastens onto a valuable culturally dependent goal, beauty or slimness in present-day society, and austerity or deprivation in medieval society. Okay. Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. But I think there's something that's missing there. I mean, yes, certainly there was a value around austerities. If we go back to the image of women, okay, when I talk about the dark feminine, okay, I always contrast this with the kind of feminine ideal that is acceptable to the church and that tends to be acceptable potentially, I don't want to say necessarily with all monotheism in general, But certainly I would say Christianity and Islam, maybe or maybe not so much with Judaism. But it is certainly an ideal that whether you practice any of those religions or not, it is certainly something that has seeped into society. Particularly, we see it in American society in this very puritanical way of thinking of things. Even though Puritanism certainly is not so much that it's a Protestant form of Christianity. It's not about the Eucharist. It's not about these kinds of mystical unions and things. But there is an ideal of femininity that exists in this particular type of culture. And this ideal is what I call the Virgin Mary model. So it's the woman who is obedient, who is chaste, okay? So therefore, either she's not having sex outside of a marital situation, and if she's not married, then she doesn't have sex at all, and perhaps, in some fashion dedicates her life to spirit, to God, right? She's giving up the sensual aspect of things to potentially transcend something. I mean, that's the ideal there. So you have this idea of virgin who's also mother at the same time. So you have this, like as in the Virgin Mary, who supposedly is somebody who, now the doctrine is that she is conceived without sin, and that she is, this perfect being who is the perfect vessel for Jesus, right? Although there's an interesting side note here with Catherine of Siena. She supposedly had a vision of the Virgin Mary in which the Virgin Mary told her she was not conceived without sin. So in other words, that she was conceived as a normal person. And later on, the church just said, somebody edited that. They just wrote that in there. They made a mistake. They wrote the wrong thing. She never would have said that. Well, we don't know that she never would have said that because we weren't there, right? But I just find it interesting that she's in this extreme state of self-mortification and this kind of austerity and self-sacrifice. That's the other aspect of this Virgin Mary model as well, is the idea of you as the sacrificial victim. Now, in this particular case, this would undoubtedly be couched as an imitation of Christ, so to speak, that you're so united with the Holy Spouse that you want to do what the Holy Spouse does. Now, for many people, that would have been considered to be almost a act of hubris or a blasphemous act. I mean, if by doctrine Christ is the one who saves their sins, right? Then for you to say that somehow by what you're doing you could save something. Now, of course, obviously, this was all. Really, it was more like, I'm praying that you take my body as a kind of sacrifice. Like, he was I want to be a sacrificial lamb too. And it's kind of interesting because from that perspective, it's almost as though she's somebody who's putting herself on the same level as Jesus. Because even with the Virgin Mary, even though like within Catholicism, the Virgin Mary is very important, Virgin Mary is certainly not regarded as a deity. Neither is Catherine of Siena. She's a saint. But nonetheless, it's like these women who are coming to this status of almost godhood. And it's also a point of which they are seeking autonomy. So I feel like her anorexic behavior, okay, where does it start? It starts when she's about to be married to her sister's widow. And it's also an observation of the fact that fasting, that with men whom, in theory, socially and politically and everything else, a woman was subject to men. And that's why obedience was so important. I mean, you even hear this in marriage vows that, if people still do, when you say to honor and to obey, and usually that's something the woman is supposed to say, not the man, in the traditional Catholic vows, or maybe not even just the Catholic ones. The idea of obedience to their so-called better, right? But that could be manipulated and that could be changed. Like you could modify the behavior of your husband by not eating. So there's a modicum of control here. There's a modicum of autonomy. So she does this and then she cuts her hair. So there's definitely this sense of somebody who's taking control. People are looking at them like an object, like something, evaluating her in terms of how presentable she's going to be and how sexually attracted someone's going to be to her. She just says, nope, I'm going to do things to make myself not sexually attractive. So she's taking this point of view. So she's really, these are sort of initial acts of rebellion. Even at the age of 6 or 7 to say, I'm going to remain a virgin, that that is an act of rebellion against a system that expects that her duty as a woman is to get married and to have children, right? So she's already somebody who's very much in rebellion. And her anorexia is really an act of rebellion. They talk about this as this holy and miraculous thing that she does, but it's generally acknowledged that this was something that she should not be doing. There was a piece in the Daily Theology, which is .org, and I'm not sure, I haven't looked up who clearly, if it's a .org, I don't know, it's clearly connected to a Catholic organization. And the woman who wrote its name is also Catherine Mahan, that's her name. So she talks about the complex Catherine of Siena and the sin of simplifying saints. So part of what she's quoting from is Raymond of Capua's biography of Catherine of Siena. He was apparently her confessor, because of course anybody who was in a religious order had to have a confessor to confess their sins. But he also wrote her biography because apparently he was very convinced of her holiness. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of what Catherine Mahan writes here at this dailytheology.org. And it says, if you look up that site and Catherine of Siena, you will find this entry. It looks like it was her feast day, or one of her feast days, 4/29, 2015. It says, St. Catherine of Siena is an incredibly complex figure, an immensely influential and vastly charitable saint of great faith on the one hand, and a stubborn, headstrong, and deeply, fatally flawed human on the other. Yeah, so she's somebody, her spiritual wisdom, particularly in her dialogue, is so renowned that she, along with Teresa of Avila, was named the first female doctor of the church. Yes, her and Teresa of Avila were both named doctor of the church in 1970, at the same time. Her mystical visions and extravagant gestures were earthy and extreme. Okay, and yeah, we're going to get into the earthy part of that. Her political counsel and spiritual advice were heeded by the highest echelons of ecclesiastical leadership. She followed her vocational calling of vowed virginity, charitable work, and prayer and community to the extent that she forged a new active community within the Dominicans beyond the bounds of traditional cloistered women religious of her day. Catherine worked out for herself a rather number of roles that both conformed to and went against 14th century ideals of holy women, which served a variety of needs of the church and the local community, and which resonate today. She says, Catherine's complexity defies easy characterization, and her fans continue to revel in her wonderfully weird and multifaceted holiness and wisdom today. So this woman, Catherine Mahan, now reflects here, and she says, I think I'm drawn to Catherine, not just because of their shared name, but because her bizarre episodes from her life. She's fascinated by how graphically embodied her mystical visions are, which we'll talk about, how physically present Christ becomes, and conversely, how mystical her corporal works of mercy became in her retelling. One memorable vision, that I will get the image out of my head. Catherine recounts a vision of union with Christ. As Catherine tells it, Jesus appeared to her and declared his intention to make her his mystical bride. Now, lots of women mystics in the Middle Ages had such visions, but only Catherine's mystical marriage included a wedding ring from Christ made of his own flesh, the foreskin from his circumcision. Yeah, that's one of the things that people note it for, that her wedding ring, and she tells people, your wedding ring is the foreskin of Christ. Now, as Catherine Mahan explains here, the relic of the Christ child foreskin was a famous and popular medieval relic, so famous, in fact, that more than one church claimed to possess it. Moreover, the idea of Christ mystically wedding Catherine with a ring of his foreskin evokes not only Eucharistic language, because the idea that the bread and wine are actually the body, flesh and blood of Christ. I don't know that it's supposed to be his foreskin, but it is the flesh and blood. And also covenantal imagery, as circumcision, which marked Jewish men as inheritors of the Abrahamic covenant. So Catherine's experience of mystical union in marriage was perhaps not unlike entering her own personal covenantal union with God, expressed in language of Eucharist and devotion, and understood in an embodied manner. And this is interesting, too, because she's somebody who deals with her mysticism through mortification of the body. But then again, the symbol of her union is something extremely, as she says, embodied. Now, typically speaking, I don't know what happens nowadays. It used to be a thing that, whether you were of the Jewish faith or not, that circumcision was something that took place in hospitals. It just was a thing that was done to boys. But although now I think it's not necessarily done as frequently. There's some questions about doing it or about why it's done and so on and so forth. So I don't know that it's necessarily a common practice in hospitals today. Maybe it still is. I don't know. I've never had any children, and I've certainly, and I don't know about the situation of any recent male babies or anything like that. So I don't really know. But I have heard that there's been a lot of pushback against just doing that as an automatic practice. So, and the idea that multiple people, first of all, who would have the foreskin of Christ? Like, that makes no sense whatsoever. That implies that you have a body somewhere, but if he was a body that, if he was bodily resurrected from the tomb, then why would you, yeah. Anyway, there was a lot of strange stuff that went on with relics in the medieval period, which we of course know. So the idea that some kind of holy, they're just, okay, I think that kind of gets back to this whole mystical idea, the way in which mystical union is embodied in such very sexualized language. As we had pointed out with Saint Teresa, there's the idea of the, you see the angel who's piercing her heart with the arrow, but with such a look on this rather androgynous looking angel's face, I'm like, you just know that this is a metaphor for, and at the same time, it's not supposed to be representing anything carnal at all. And here we have Catherine of Siena, who is doing a lot of mortification of the flesh through starvation, through not eating, through only taking Eucharist, which is really the ingesting of the flesh of Christ. That's the only thing that she's doing. Now, I think I talked about this in the last episode, about the way in which the taking of Eucharist would have the effect of for somebody who is perhaps either prepared through that monastic state where one has this very internal experience where they're spending a lot of time in solitude, in the way of which the hermits, in which they can have these visions that they have when they live in the solitude and this quiet, this kind of enforced quiet, which is, to a certain degree, I feel like that's essential to the experience. I mean, the experience itself, the mystical experience itself, is something that you can't sit down and plan and say, I'm going to do these 3 steps and have a mystical experience. Like, that doesn't happen. Even if you take drugs, sorry guys, you do that, it's not going to guarantee you have a mystical experience. But mystical experience does tend to come in meditative states. It certainly does come as part of a state of solitude or quiet, which is why silent retreats and things like that are so popular, but it doesn't have to happen there. As I explained in the last episode, just out of my own experience, I had found that once I had started practicing Hindu meditation and so forth, that if I did receive Eucharist after that, like if I went to a family funeral or some kind of a thing where they were having a mass, my rationale was always, well, I was baptized Catholic and I did make all the sacraments, so if I want to do it, I can. Whether the church would feel that way about it, they'd probably tell me, no, you're not supposed to do that, and really, I don't really identify as Catholic at this point, but I've often I always think of, well, I got the membership card, so if I feel like doing it, I will. But I often found that when I did take Eucharist, it was like, there is a profound effect that happens, that kind of whatever's going on with the body, it sort of, I don't know, it changes it. It kind of puts you in this different state of being, in this different state of feeling, and it can bring about a lot of compassion. I always talk about it as like a heart opening. It's not that I am not one of those people who thinks that that's BS. I do think that actually happens. But as I've said before, I don't feel like the church encourages that in the laity. If you are just a regular Joe Schmo person going to church, they're not, even though in theory this is an experience that could or should affect you, the idea that it would affect you if you are not clergy or you are not living some kind of life that's overseen by an authority and approved, it's almost like, who are you to have this experience? People like, as I was told, people like you don't have these experiences. Oh, yeah? And interestingly, I have found that among people who are in the laity who do have that experience, and I don't know, maybe this is one of the reasons they discourage it, is those people sometimes become very, very militant in their Catholicism, as though that opening up experiences makes them cognizant of something greater than themselves, and the reaction that they have is one of fear. Probably because they have been raised to believe in this idea of sin and shame and things like that, which is inherent. The idea is that people are not perfect. They're born into what, quote unquote, original sin, which means you're alive. Oh my gosh, original sin. Sorry, I'm not a big believer in the idea of original sin. I think it's a mythology that has cut us off from life in general. That's my opinion. Certainly, which is why I'm definitely about re-embracing this dark feminine, because really what's happening here is you're having women who are placing themselves, in trying to perfect that particular ideal of womanhood, taking that almost Virgin Mary role. Although Virgin Mary, of course, is not the bride of Christ. The church is actually supposed to be the bride of Christ by that doctrine. But that the individual soul is now able to dissolve into that state of no-thing. But the foreskin thing, I mean, what this Catherine Mahan is saying, she's correct about that, about the way in which these holy relics, that this would have been a thing. And yes, that I think that's a very reasonable thing to say, okay, well, yes, this is communion through flesh, and also the idea of circumcision as a covenant. So understood. But I also feel like, there's something, it's really weird how there's this sort of erotic, visceral element with taking, it's like this weird, it's like eroticism by taking the sexual piece out, sort of, or making sex just to be something metaphorical rather than something literal. And it's almost like it's almost like the reverse of what you would have in a sexual experience, because the idea is that with sex is something pleasurable. It's a sensual experience. It's an enjoyment of the union of two people. And it's almost like this is occurring, but it's occurring through great physical anguish and aestheticism and pain. You are mortifying the body to have this experience that, I guess, in theory, is better than the sexual experience, better than sex, right? It's something that is more long-lasting and in theory, supposed to remove the burden. But Catherine of Siena was very, very big on this idea that she was here that she sort of wanted to participate in the whole saving the soul of the church kind of a thing, which is really interesting. Just to read a little more from Catherine Mahan's piece, she says, I think I'm amazed by Catherine's many correspondences and meetings with important ecclesial and political figures in her day, many of which feature Catherine critiquing clerics' personal moral failings or chastising the Pope over the great scandal of the church at the time, the residency of the papacy in Avignon, France, instead of in Rome. She says, or I sympathize with her youthful vocational daydream to run away, dress as a man, and enter the Dominican order to fulfill her dreams of serving the church and ministering to her fellow Christians. So there you go. Now, there's another thing, too, wanting to discard her feminine role and take on a masculine one that she managed to develop as a third-order lay Dominican. So, she's part of the laity that's taken vows, manages to form an order. And she says, the tragedy of Catherine's illness and death fascinates modern readers. While her dietary habits seem to align with the classic symptoms of anorexia, after some years her strict fasting made her weak and ill, and she attempted to subsist only on raw vegetables and the Eucharist. It's historically anachronistic and irresponsible to ascribe modern medical conditions to historical figures, and it blinds us to their own understandings of themselves. The idea, as we just saw in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the way that they're talking about her as having this anorexia mirabilis as opposed to the anorexia nervosa, they're trying to say, well, no, there is a commonality because in both cases, these are women trying to meet a value system. And here she is saying, no, that's not what's really happening here. She says, for many medieval women like Catherine, giving food to the poor went hand in hand with denying oneself food. Not only did they experience hunger and solidarity with the poor, the food that went to the poor was the food they would have eaten. It was a commendable practice of self-denial for the sake of others. But for Catherine, her denial of self for the sake of others led to others being denied her presence due to her extended decline and early death. So she goes on, and the point that this person's making in her Daily Theology article is the idea that the way that people simplify the lives of saints. And it's interesting the way she says this. With Catherine and with other saints, we take bits and pieces of the story of a holy life, break it down so that we might understand it, and retell it according to this cliche or that classification. We sanitize the gore, play down the extreme, gloss over the flaws, and domesticate the unruly aspects of saints. We turn their remarkable, even revolutionary witness to life in Christ in just another moral model of example of virtue. To caricature the saints or to ignore parts of their lives is to rob them of their humanity, taking away their human foibles and making them into our own image of saintly perfection. In turning the saints into models, we frequently make their example unattainable. Yeah, because really, supposedly, the idea of the saint is the idea that you, the average person, can achieve this level of holiness. Now, I still think it's kind of a ridiculous level of holiness, but, and again, there's something, because there's an idea of sanitizing it. It gets me back to the idea of Tantra again in Hinduism, where you are talking, Tantra is, like I said, it's a word for weaving, and it really it has less to do with the Vedas and the scriptures and all of the pure ways of understanding Hinduism and Hindu ideas about caste and doctrine and their own guidelines and beliefs in terms of and stories that are there. But Tantra has more to do with the real world and practical things, and of course has a lot to do with sex and the embodiment of sex and the way in which being embodied makes us, there is something mystical in our own embodiment. Like it's not as though, the body is something to be thrown away. The spirit is the thing to be preserved. The body is not. We see something of this in Catherine of Siena, but yet we also have this really strong language and vision of embodiment. So it's interesting. So it makes me almost feel like the not only the anorexia piece, but when you look at everything she did sort of in context here, and then the fact that she had all this political power, which I think it's just fascinating that the popes were sending her as an emissary to, like, that apparently she has such an eloquence and such a way of speaking that they think she can cure this rift. And of course, obviously, she's considered to be, politically speaking, she's great, for the Roman Catholic Church is going to look at her because in a favorable light, because she was about bringing the papacy back to Rome. So certainly her political support of the popes, and supposedly, just like she had a vision to leave her bedroom and go tend to the poor and sick, now she's got this idea that she is going to the political ills of the church, or trying to repair the church in some fashion. And she stand behind popes that may or may not have been worthy of being stood behind. I don't know. But the fact that she got very, very heavily involved in politics, and while it's clear that sometimes she wasn't successful, nonetheless, it does seem like that she may have had some kind of an influence here. Apparently, in one point, she almost got herself assassinated as well, because she somehow, who she was in the company of to go in these negotiations she was involved in, there was a kind of an uprising against the group she was with, and she was nearly assassinated, but was saved. Which, as she had said, it would have made me a martyr. In her view, that would have made her a martyr. I'm not sure if it would have, but maybe it would have been viewed that way. And so she's got this political power, too, to some degree. Not quite at the same level, and I mean, strictly speaking, the men that she went with didn't necessarily have the power of persuasion either. But really, really fascinating that her determined autonomy, which apparently did earn her criticisms, although I don't feel like this made the Holy Inquisition go after her. I'm not hearing anything about her being brought up, like as Teresa of Avila, the Inquisition was looking a bit at her. Although this is, I don't know. This may have actually been slightly before that period of time, so maybe that's why. This was roughly around the time that she was writing this and talking about her visions was around the time that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, right? And this has created the kind of image that we have of heaven and hell. The one that we still adhere to is very much connected to that Dantean vision. It's interesting that she has these kinds of visions of heaven, hell, and purgatory. At the same time, Dante's writing about these visions of heaven, hell, and purgatory. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if there's a connection in the imagery there, if one influenced the other in any way. Although it seems like her writing is something that came a bit later. But she's really did an awful lot in 33 years. Okay, so what else did I want to say about her? We have this very strongly physical idea that is connected to her. We see this woman with political power, so we definitely have issues here dealing with autonomy. the ways, I guess, in which women could be independent in the kind of system that was set up in medieval times. What are the different ways that women are independent in a society where they are second-class citizens and basically subject to their husbands, unless perhaps they are somebody who has a lot of money, and then maybe even then, there's still certain expectations that are laid upon women, and the way in which the spiritual life ends up being a kind of way out for these women to a certain degree. And also the idea of using celibacy and virginity as a kind of means of autonomy, as a rebellion against a system that expects you to, produce babies, to marry and to be fruitful and multiply, so to speak. That the marriage that they're going to have is the marriage to the deity. And I don't know, this is really an interesting aspect of mysticism that I've talked about. I've talked about it in the previous episode, and I think about it again, is that mysticism is actually quite a threatening act within the church. Even though we have all of these mystics, both male and female, who are regarded as, oh, look at these holy and saintly people, really in terms of the social structure and so forth, they're destabilizing. And again, the focus on the poor, Catherine of Siena, I believe, is the one, I'm not reading it in any of these texts, but I believe she is the one who would suck the pus out of people's wounds and stuff. I mean, really disgusting, kind of grotesque things, but she was weirdly Chtonic in the way that she approached things. And just this idea of the way in which one dealt with the flesh and that one dealt with pain, and the way that she delighted in physical pain. I don't want to call her a masochist, but there's just something about the way that you embody that and that you relish that kind of mortification. Yeah, I can't help it. I can't help having this kind of there's something sadomasochistic about it in a way. The idea that, but I don't think we're necessarily conceiving of it in a sexual way. Maybe being more conceived of in a way of feeling like, because one of the things I was reading in one of her books, she's talking about wanting to take on the mantle of sin, which this reminds me a little bit of a story of my guru, where somebody said to one of the swamis she had said he wanted to take on some of the suffering that she endured as the guru, or some of the karmic suffering, and she says, no, you can't even take on a little bit. You can't, unless you are in that space, a certain space. You can't, because the guru is said to help to bear some of the sufferings of her or his disciples. And she had said, well, no, you can't. And so the Swami begged her, and finally she says, okay, I'll let you take on a little bit. And apparently he was racked with fever and was violently sick for days, until finally she said, okay, yeah, that's enough. But there's this idea that bearing, this is what in the East they would call karmic debt or karmic suffering, that bearing that in the face of the infinite, like what the message that Catherine of Siena has in her work, that she's told, you can't take on, you can't atone for even the smallest sin when you're talking about the infinite, when you're talking about the space of the infinite. Now, for a comparison, if you think about the way in which archaic religion works, where if you appeal to a particular force or being or daemonic figure or deity, whatever, generally you're making almost like a deal with that. You're negotiating with that being. That being will do something for you, but you also need to give something up and do something for that deity. When your deity is something that represents the ultimate embodiment and reality of everything, then there's no way that you can recompense anything on that level. There's no way to do it. So when you're talking about something that's existing outside of the earthly sphere, outside of the sphere of time, you can't possibly do it. You can't possibly take this on. So yeah, there's something about this. There's, I don't know. I think one of the weirdnesses, if they want to call it that, of St. Catherine of Siena, is that she's almost, in a way, there's just something very pagan about what she's doing, with the exception of the kind of virginal thing, which is actually her embodying this particular ideal of womanhood. Because, like I said, you had to be virginal, or you had to be chastely and monogamously within your marriage in order to be considered to be any kind of ideal of womanhood, either doing your duty by producing babies, or doing your duty by being chaste and obedient in a more virginal sense. And I feel like this was something that, because these were the only two acceptable modes of femininity, that this is something that she embraced. She embraced it very strongly as a means of kind of gaining power. But again, her imagery and her understanding and her connection to all of this is very, very Chtonic in its own way. So, and I think that's one of the things that makes her very complicated. You can't, as I agree with this piece that Catherine Mahan writes, in the sense that, yeah, you can't just simplify and just gloss over all of this stuff. And if anything, if there's a lesson within Catholicism for this, it's just that the realities of these things are actually very, very complex. It's not just simply a matter of, oh, this person's good and perfect and does everything good and perfect, and everything that they do and everything that they say is perfectly in line. I mean, they change things around to make it perfectly in line. Or the actual mystic themselves, if they think they're going to get into trouble, will try to couch things in ways that fit into doctrine or whatever. And they do it through a kind of a self-depreciating process. I mean, if you read both St. Catherine's writings and also Teresa of Avila, they only speak of themselves in the third person. I knew of a person who, and they're talking about themselves, but they never talk about themselves in the first person. It's like that. I'm not going to talk about myself as a person of consequence. I'm not going to show off. You know what I mean? They're not going to have that ego thing. So there's something that's going on here that's very concealed. But the language that's being used to represent this mystical union and so forth is very, very sexualized and very Chtonic. And I would say that's true of both of them. So, yeah, there's this rejection of food, and there's an aspiration towards this very spiritual way of being. But at the same time, almost paradoxically, there's this very strongly embodied and graphically, sometimes even, sensual, or just very much dealing with stuff of the body. There's this relationship to the body that's, like I said, dealing with the sick by draining the wounds, sucking out the pus and stuff of people's wounds and stuff, and imagining your marriage to Christ as wearing his foreskin as your wedding ring. I mean, there's just all of this stuff that is so deeply embodied in the stuff that is repellent to us, or that is taboo in some fashion. So this is the thing I really find fascinating about her, is that and on the one hand, she ends up being this model of the good virgin woman, the good virgin feminine, and at the same time, there's something wildly Chtonic about it, in the way that she embodies her or discusses her connection to the divine, and it's almost like there's a rejection of carnality, because she's rejecting that kind of control over her body by a man in some way. Like the only person who's going to have any, she's going to have control over her own physical destiny. And even if that meant a shorter life for her. And it's just interesting how this autonomy, how it fueled her in her own way, and how yet it made her more present and more embodied. As I was saying earlier about Tantra, I mean, that's what Tantra is. Tantra deals in pollution, right? It deals in things that are polluted. And she is dealing with the pollution. Typically speaking, these are not things that the church approves of or necessarily wants people to get involved in. But by her going through this, it's like she achieves her process of perfection, but she does it in a very embodied and Chtonic way by dealing with what is repellent, right? Just one interesting little final story about her. Supposedly after she died, everybody has an obsession with relics, and people, I think it was of Siena, wanted a piece of her body as a relic. And so somehow they had managed to smuggle her head, detach her head from the body and try to smuggle it out of Rome. But then they were stopped by the guards, and they had to open up the bag. Instead of her head, it was just a bag full of rose. It was a bag full of rose petals. And that, of course, gets to the idea of the rose and the rose scent as being very much connected to the divine feminine. And then supposedly this turned back into her head again after they left. But yeah, the idea of the rose. In fact, her symbols, I don't think I even mentioned this. Her symbols are the lily, the book, the crown of thorns, and occasionally the heart, because supposedly she's traded hearts with Jesus. And the crown of thorns, of course, represents that physical suffering we're talking about. The book, of course, clearly her eloquence. And the lily is an interesting one because it is kind of a death symbol. But lily is also certainly those who practice Lenormand and things like that. It conveys a certain type of wisdom, but also a certain type of sensuality as well. So, and whether or not that's the way the church wants to interpret it, that is what the symbol is. So, very interesting story. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I want to thank my patrons once again. As my lists are getting bigger, it's getting kind of harder to put them onto one little slide in my videos. So I'm starting to branch out, which is a good thing. I mean, the more that can join us, the merrier. I mean, it's and the more that I can actually do. So I want to thank all my new patrons who have joined recently. If you would like to see all my work, my website is chthonia.net. I know that the podcast updates frequently there, but then you can see what I have in publications and so forth. Hopefully, I'll be making some updates to that soon as I finish some more work that may be coming out. And if you want to follow me on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast. It's one word on Instagram and on X. It's 2 words on Facebook. I am mostly on Instagram and Facebook, just so you know. I don't spend a whole lot of time on X. But I do have accounts in all 3 places if you want to follow me. Thank you so much for listening, and until the next episode.